What's going on, guys? Welcome back. Hope you're doing well. In our last video, we went over a quick bug fix and also a small code refactor. In this video, I want us to go over how we can start showing the user's most recent conversations in our inbox here. So in the completed app, it would look something like this. This is how any message app is going to function. It's going to show your most recent conversations with users in this list here. And if you click on it, it will take you over to that chat, right? So here's how we're going to do this. There's some backend implementation we need to add here to get this set up. So I'm going to pull up the Firebase project for the completed code right here. And this is how we're going to structure this. So in your messages collection, right, this is a list of all of the users' open chats right here. This means the Joker, let's see, has a chat with Bruce Wayne and Steve Rogers. But then we also are going to add this recent messages collection. And this is just going to be in charge of storing the most recent message for that particular chat. So if we can see here, the IDs are exactly the same. So this corresponds to Steve Rogers, and this one corresponds to the Batman, and it's just going to store the most recent message for that chat. So that way, this makes it really easy for us to just display the most recent message there. And every time we send a message, we're just going to update this guy right here to display the most recent chat. There's a couple different ways of doing this. You could, just look at the message list and then go and get the most recent one. That's another option. This is just the implementation I chose to go with here. In the pro version of this course, guys, which is going to be available on my website at stephancodes.com, where I'm going to add a bunch of additional features, I think we're going to do a backend restructuring to make our backend more efficient. One of my subscribers here made a comment on how to improve the efficiency of the backend, and that's going to be implemented in one of the next videos. So shout out to you. I can't remember your name off the top of my head, but he gave me some awesome tips, and I am not a backend engineer. I am an iOS engineer, so this could definitely be better. But we're going to stick with this structure for the purposes of this course. So let's go ahead and go over how to introduce this recent messages collection and then how we can display those in this list here. Okay. So in our chat service, guys, in the send message function, we are going to go over how to create this recent messages reference. So I'm going to add some two more references here. So this is the current user ref and the chat partner ref. We're going to add two more. So we're going to say let recent current user ref equal Firestore constants, spelling that wrong, dot messages collection, dot document current UID, dot collection recent dash messages, dot document chat partner ID. And then we're going to create another one that's called recent partner ref. So I'm going to say let recent partner ref, and we can go ahead and pretty much just copy this. And all we need to swap is the current UID and the chat partner ID. So go ahead and say chat partner ID and then current UID. So we can see here that this obviously isn't the most efficient way of structuring our backend. We're doing a lot of like repeated writes to our database here. And like I said, it can definitely be improved, which will be done in the pro version of this course, guys. Available on my website at stephancodes.com in about 2 weeks from now. And that will include a bunch of extra features that we see here, like scrolling to the bottom of the chat every time there's a new message, pagination, image messaging, group messaging, and all of that good stuff. So make sure you check that out if you want a full chat feature here. But anyway, let's go ahead and go over what we need to do to now upload the message to this collection here. So down here, guys, we're going to say, it's pretty easy. We're just going to say recent current user ref dot set data, message data, recent partner ref dot set data, message data. So now every time we send a message, it will update that recent messages collection, and that's what we're going to be fetching our information from in our inbox view to display these recent messages here. So let's go ahead and test this out, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and run the application and just send a message to the Joker or the Batman, whoever I'm logged in as, and see if it updates that guy there. So yeah, I'm Batman here. I'm going to send a message to the Joker, testing recent messages collection update. So we sent that. And if I pull up my Firestore database, let's go ahead and refresh this. So yep, now we see recent messages, right? And this is my most recent message, and I see that right there. So now that we are successfully updating that, we are going to now go ahead and fetch these recent messages from this collection to display them in our inbox view. So what we're going to do now, guys, is go back into the code, and we are going to create an inbox service. And this inbox service is going to be in charge of fetching our most recent messages here. And this is going to be another observing relationship, because obviously as soon as messages show up in that collection or get changed in that collection, we want them to display here. So let's go ahead and go to our core folder, go to inbox, and create a service folder. Oops. Create a new file. It's going to be a Swift file, and we're going to call this inbox service. We're going to make a struct called inbox service. We're going to have a published variable for our document changes, and we need to import Firebase here. And I'll explain this in a little bit. Let's just go ahead and add a function called observe recent messages. And we are going to get the currently logged in user's ID. Just like that. And then we're going to create a query. So we're going to say let query equal Firestore constants dot messages collection dot document UID dot collection recent dash messages. Make sure you guys spell this right. We should probably add this to a constants list as well, but I'll leave that to you guys. It just will minimize the possibility of misspells and typos and stuff. So let's keep going. Then we just need to order it by timestamp. So I'm going to say .order by descending. Timestamp descending is true. And I'm going to go ahead and just add some indentation here, guys, because that's one really long line of code. And that looks a little better. Okay. So now we are going to say query.add snapshot listener and hit enter on that block and say snapshot. I typically don't handle the error for this stuff. And we're going to say guard let changes equals snapshot dot document changes dot filter, add two curly brackets and say 0 dot type equals dot added or 0 dot type equals dot modified. And I'm going to add an indent here, right there, and say else return. So basically, guys, we're going to get back a bunch of changes whenever that snapshot listener fires off. And why is that? Okay, so we actually need to make this a class. Sorry, guys. So to get rid of this error, in order to be able to publish things, this inbox service has to be a class. But anyway, back to this. Whenever our listener fires off and gives us some data, we are going to only want to look at the data that is added or modified, right? So if something gets added to that particular collection, or if something gets modified in that collection, then we want to get that data back. So then we are just going to go here and say self.document changes equals changes. We need to do that within this block here. Okay, so basically what's going to happen here is that we are just going to publish these document changes in this inbox service, and then we are going to construct our message data from those particular document changes. We don't need to do all of that sort of mapping logic in the service class. We can handle that in the view model. And the reason for that is because this logic does get a little complicated. There's a lot of different things that could happen here, right? We could add a new conversation, or we could receive updates from an existing conversation. So for example, if Tony Stark sent me a message, it would have to insert a new chat into this conversation list. If Steve Rogers sent me a message, then I would need to just delete this guy and move it to the top of the list. So there's a couple different scenarios as far in terms of how this list can get updated. We don't want to have to worry about that implementation logic in the service class. We want to leave that for the view model to figure out. So we're just giving the view model the data that it needs, and then the view model can go through all of the logic or sort of business logic there to update the view correctly. So inside of our view model now, guys, we are going to set up this service and go ahead and figure out how we can get that data back. So the first thing we're going to do is create another published property here that is going to be for our recent messages. So I'm going to say at published var recent messages equals an array of messages, right? And then we need to somehow get the data from the service class, and we're going to do that the same way we did here with this user service by using Combine. So we're just going to say inbox service, and we don't have a shared instance. That can come later on, so you can just initialize it here like that and say .document changes .sync and say weak self, so we don't run into any retain cycles, and you're going to say changes in. So I'm going to create a function here, guys, called load initial messages from changes, and it's going to be an array of document changes. So what we're going to do is say let messages equal changes.compactMat, open up two curly brackets, try 0.data or .document.data as message.self. So this is our messages array, and that will give us back the text and the timestamp of the message, but it won't give us back any user data. So we actually need to go and fire off another API call once we get these messages back that's going to fetch our user data for us here. And then we can set the user on each one of those messages to ultimately load their profile image. So what we're going to do is say for I in 0 up to but less than messages.count. We're going to say let message equal messages I, and I'll explain why we are looping through the indices here in a little bit, guys. And also go ahead and change this guy to a variable here because we are going to need to modify this messages array by setting the user object on it. Then we are going to say user service dot fetch. So we actually need to implement a function here to fetch a user with a particular UID. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can just hop into our user service. So we have a function for fetching all of our users and fetching the current user, right? So let's add another function for just fetching any user. So we're going to say static func fetch user with UID, which is a string. And unfortunately, guys, we cannot use async await here because all of this snapshot listener stuff is done using completion handlers and callbacks, and you can't mix and match the two. So we can't use like this fetch user with an async throws inside of a function that is that contains a completion handler or a callback. So we have to use a completion here. So we're going to say completion at escaping user arrow void. So this is the old school way of doing things, I guess you could say. And a lot of you guys have probably seen this before, but for those of you that haven't, I'll do a brief explanation of it in a second. So we're just going to go here and say firestore constants.users collection .document UID .get document. And you guys notice here that this Firebase option from the Firebase code gives us the option to use a completion handler, right? So when I go here and I hit enter, this will give me back the snapshot. And once again, we don't care about the error. So this is what's known as a callback. For those of you who don't know what that is, it just means that whenever this API call is complete, it will give us back this data. So this happens asynchronously within our code. If I added some line here that just said print hello, this would fire off, and then line 36 would execute before we got back into this block with this data back, because this takes time, right? So say this takes 1 second to complete. My code will continue on with its execution, and then 1 second later, it will come back inside of this block once it gets this data back from our API call. This is different from async throws, where everything happens in line or synchronously, right? Like this line of code doesn't happen until we get back the result from this line of code. So it makes it much cleaner to use this async throws functionality. But unfortunately here, we can't do that because that isn't supported for snapshot listeners. So let's keep going. We're just going to say guard let user equal try snapshot.data as user.self else return, and then we are just going to say completion user. So our function here is going to give us back a user when this guy completes. So very similar to how we got a callback with the snapshot here. When we call this function here, our callback will give us a user back, or a completion handler will give us back a user, which is exactly what we want. So let's go back to our inbox view model, and we can call this function now. I can say user service dot fetch user with a particular UID, and the user ID we want to fetch is message dot chat partner ID, and it will give us back the user. And we can say messages I.user equals that user. And then we're just going to say self.recentMessages.append messages I. So there is a bit of information to unpack here, guys. We are going to come back to this. I want to go through with the rest of the implementation here, just so we can make sure that this stuff is working. So up here, we notice that we need to add some changes as well. So one, we need to call this function, and then you guys see that result of call sync receive value is unused. So first thing we need to do is say dot store in cancellables, and then we are going to say self dot load initial messages from those document changes. So we can see this sort of coming together here, right? The service just gives us back these document changes, and then within the view model, we go through all of the implementation logic that's necessary for loading the messages and updating this recent messages property. So now that we are publishing this, let's go ahead and go over to our inbox view and find this list that we have here for each 0 to 10 ID self, and we are going to replace this with view model.recent messages, guys. And next up, we are going to go to this inbox row view and make sure that we are populating that with actual message data. So let's go to our inbox row view. Let's initialize it with a message and start replacing this hard-coded data with actual message data, right? So first off, we're going to replace this mock user with our message.user. And then here, we're going to replace Heath Ledger with message.user.fullname. And we need to give it a default value of blank string. And then here, we're going to replace this with message.message text, guys. And we can just comment this preview out for now. Typically what I do is I'll create like some mock data for the message, but I don't think we really need to do that anymore. So I just comment that out. Out of laziness, really, you guys can create mock data for the message if you want. It will definitely help if you ever want to work on the UI for that again. And in the completed source code, we definitely have all of that mock data set up. So let's just keep going with our implementation here, guys. Back in our inbox view, we now need to populate this inbox row view with the message that is coming back from our view model inside of this for loop. And the last thing we need to do is make sure that we fire off that API call. And this is going to get a little bit tricky with how we use this inbox service. So if you guys just went up to your init method and said inbox service dot observe recent messages, I don't believe this would work. Let's go ahead and run our code here. And you guys notice that nothing comes up, but it should be coming up, right? But that's because we're using two separate instances of this inbox service here. So when we initialize this guy, it's firing off that recent messages observation call, and it's populating the document changes, but then this uses an entirely separate instance. So we want to make sure that these two guys are using the same instance so that when we call this function, it updates this instance of the document changes. We don't need to implement a shared instance just yet. That will come later on when we want some additional functionality. So let's just go here, guys, and say private let service equal inbox service, and replace this guy with service.observe recent messages and this guy with service.document-changes.sync. So now we are using the same exact instance for all of our service calls and observations. So everything should be good to go now. So this should now come together and we should see our users' message data showing up. So I have two conversations going on. You guys could go ahead and start some more. And notice that everything will show up with the corresponding user data as well. So before we end this video, I just want to unpack what's going on in this load initial messages function, because there is, some confusing sort of for loop stuff going on. So basically, guys, we're passing in these document changes that we're getting back from our Combine publisher. And then we create this messages array from that data, right? So this is how we actually convert the raw data we get back from Firestore from those document changes into this messages array. And then the problem with this, guys, is that this gives us back the message data, but we have to sort of make a chained API call to get the user data associated with each message. If I didn't do that, right? Let's say I comment out this line of code and run my code here. Let's see what happens. You guys notice I only get the message data back, right? Like there's nothing about my user. Right now, all we have is their full name. The profile image stuff will come later, but you can see the problem here, right? So we don't have that information off the bat, right? So if I open up my Firestore database, we notice that each message, let's see, has a from ID, a message text, a to ID, blah, 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 right? So we need to figure out who we're talking to and grab that user ID, and then we need to go to the users collection and fetch the corresponding user data for that person. So that's sort of where the message.chatPartner ID comes in, right? So even the message could be, even though these messages are from myself, like I sent both of these messages, I don't want to load my own personal user data in here, right? I want to load the data for the person that I'm talking to. So that's where this chat partner ID comes in, if you guys remember when we set that up. So that's the whole purpose of this here. We want to figure out who our chat partner is so that we can load the chat partner data for the conversations regardless of who sent the most recent message. So a mistake that I see some people make is they only fetch the user data for maybe like if I sent the message, I don't want to load my currently logged in user information here. I want to load the person that I'm talking to. So once again, that's the purpose of our chat partner ID. And here we set the message on the user, set the user on the message using the result of this function call that this fetch user call that we wrote, where we can fetch any user with a particular user ID. So that's where we use the chat partner ID to fetch that user data. We set the user on that message, and then once the user is set on that particular message, then we append it to our recent messages guy, right? So that's when the UI actually gets updated. Right now, this is all just sort of local to the view model, and only when we have all of the data that we need do we actually update our recent messages array, and it will look nice and clean with all of the user's data in there as well. So let me just run that one more time to make sure it's looking good. There we go. Cool. So you guys notice that looks good, and that is going to wrap it up for this video, guys. In the next one, we are going to go over how to introduce the navigation to click on one of these guys to take us over to our chat, right? So you guys notice that my only entry point into my chats is doing this, and that's definitely annoying. We definitely need to be able to click on this stuff to have it take us over there. And then we're also going to fix these timestamps as well to make sure that it's displaying accurate data like we see here. So thanks for watching this one, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Peace out.